When Michael Carreras came back to Hammer as the new managing director in 1971, he brought with him lots of new ideas for the company, one of which was to start developing television series. And one of the first ones he came up with was something called The Devil and All His Works, which was going to be an anthology series based on the works of Dennis Wheatley. The television anthology series didn't happen. To the Devil a Daughter, however, would have been one of the episodes, and this was one that they were particularly keen on developing.
To the Devil a Daughter was released in 1976 and comes at the very end of Hammer Films' original horror production run. It's released 20 years after The Curse of Frankenstein is released, and although it inhabits the same world, a world of monsters and demons, it addresses that world in quite different fashions. It is more international. Not only is the film a co-production with a German production company, it also begins with Nastassja Kinski arriving at the airport.
We must go.
It is an international world. Richard Widmark is an American author who's working in London. There is a gloss to it, a glitz to it, which doesn't appear in the same way in Hammer's early horror films.
John Peacock wrote the first draft of the scripts for To the Devil a Daughter, and Christopher Wicking was then brought in to polish it. He wasn't very impressed with what he saw. He said it was a bit of a mess at this point. Christopher Wicking himself didn't actually have an awful lot of success in straightening out the script. Peter Sykes, the director of the film, worked alongside an uncredited Gerald Vaughan Hughes, who would later write The Duelists, Ridley Scott's debut film, and they tried their best to knock it into shape. Unfortunately, by the time production started, they were still working on it. EMI had been financing a lot of the recent Hammer films, and Nat Cohen was impressed by The Exorcist and could see the potential of To the Devil a Daughter, but he wasn't very keen on the budget that Hammer had produced. It was much higher than he was prepared to pay, and in fact producer Roy Skeggs had to go away and shave off £10,000 from the budget before Nat Cohen would even consider it. Even then, Cohen was only prepared to put up 50% of the budget ahead of production, which left Hammer in a bit of a quandary. They needed to find the money for the rest of the money very quickly. And Michael Carreras in fact struck a deal with the German company Terra Filmkunst in June 1975, who were able to put up the rest of the money.
What's very striking about The Devil a Daughter is we suddenly see, rather than sort of, the Michael Rippers and so on of Hammer's repertory company, it's full of, the cream of British acting talent at the time, who basically can't get film work because there are hardly any films being made in Britain.
To the Devil a Daughter has one of the best casts of any Hammer film, not just of the 70s, but of any time really. They've got Richard Widmark, who is a bit of a throwback in some ways to the early days of Hammer films where they used to import American stars. Here we've got an American star being brought in, and despite his misgivings with Hammer and the way the film was made, he actually gives a very good performance.
Apparently he was difficult on set. He considered Hammer unprofessional, referred to them as Mickey Mouse productions, made himself rather disagreeable by all accounts. That's sad to hear, but I think he's very good in the part. It's not an earth-shaking performance, but he holds the film together. He's the guy who has to carry the film, and I think he's very, very plausible.
And I know you, Michael Rayner, isn't it? Oh, I beg your pardon, Father Michael Rayner.
When John Verney is charged with looking after Catherine Beddoes, he turns to a couple of his acquaintance to help him. One of them is his agent, played by Honor Blackman, and the other is her lover, played by Anthony Valentine. And I think they anchor this film very nicely in a very recognisable human reality. They're very believable characters. They're very nicely played.
They bounce very nicely off one another. There's a little sexual frisson between them, which is just, I think, right. It's not too far, it's not too soppy.
You knew I was kinky.
Darling, let's not get involved in this.
I'm not getting involved, I'm just curious, that's all.
Please, leave it to John.
Do you want to finish the game?
No. I want to play something else.
It just works beautifully, and therefore it's very, very upsetting when Honor Blackman's quite sexy, quite sassy character meets a very unfortunate end.
They actually bring some light and warmth into this very grim film. I mean, the film couldn't by any stretch of the imagination be described as a barrel of laughs, but they do have an hilarious exchange at one point when Honor Blackman asks Nastassja Kinski if she can try on her wimple. And Honor Blackman says, "I promise to be good while I'm wearing it." And then she comes into the doorway modelling this wimple and says to Anthony Valentine,
Darling, would this go with Wellingtons?
and totally deadpan, and Valentine replies,
Wellington's what?
and it's genuine. It's probably, I think, possibly one of the funniest exchanges in all Hammer films.
Christopher Lee gives Into the Devil a Daughter perhaps one of his finest performances for Hammer films. It is, as usual, a performance of tremendous detail, of tremendous nuance, and he is utterly terrifying.
Te adoro et te invoco.
Christopher Lee's involvement into The Devil a Daughter went back nearly 20 years. He was a personal friend of Dennis Wheatley's. They first met at a Harrods literary luncheon in late 1957. In fact, Lee was making his breakthrough film, Dracula, at the time.
Christopher Lee had obviously been a mainstay of Hammer films right from the very early days, but he'd become a little disenchanted over the more recent years. The roles he was getting he didn't feel were quite what he wanted, particularly Dracula, who he felt had been somewhat demeaned in the Dracula series created by Hammer. I don't think he has anything to complain about at all into The Devil a Daughter. His father, Michael Rayner, is absolutely terrifying. It's the best role that Christopher Lee had been given for at least a decade. Absolutely wonderful performance. He makes the most of it.
Just as he had been on the side of the forces of good in The Devil Rides Out in 1967, now he is one of cinema's, I think, most disconcerting and disturbing proponents of the black arts. Father Michael Rayner is definitely one of Lee's best performances. There's a kind of sweet reason about the way he plays it.
Thank you, sister. Catherine?
There are two lovely but brief performances into The Devil a Daughter from Derek Francis, who had previously appeared as the farmer in Rasputin the Mad Monk, also against Christopher Lee, and in one of her earliest screen appearances, Frances de la Tour as a Salvation Army major.
Strange are the ways of the Lord.
That's true.
But please stay and listen with your heart and join us in song.
I'd love to, but some other time.
Well, so The Devil and Daughter isn't a film just, shot in studio at Elstree, as almost everything had by Hammer for the previous sort of 5 years. This is a film largely shot in very real locations. Even its interiors, many of them are real. They're actual churches, for example. I think one of the most striking location sequences is when Catherine, played by Nastassja Kinski, escapes Verney's care and runs from St Catherine's Dock across Tower Bridge and into the underground itself, and we actually start to see a real world appearing in a Hammer film. In a way that we haven't, I don't think, ever really before. A streets full of bystanders, looking at her and gazing upon her. We see her in airports. We see them. It's a very, very real background.
Paul Glass's highly experimental score for To the Devil a Daughter is a world away from the melodic, lyrical music provided by composers such as James Bernard or Harry Robinson in the past.
It's quite a discordant score, very strange, very odd, very experimental, and it was all done without the use of synthesizers. Glass was a little suspicious of synthesizers and believed that perhaps they would eventually replace orchestral scores altogether. He probably wasn't wrong. And he decided he wanted to use ordinary instruments and human voices, but in a very different and unusual way. Everything you hear in the score is actually a traditional instrument or a human voice, but it's just been treated and processed and played in a very unusual manner.
This is something that's genuinely unsettling, which works perfectly for the film. It's not something that one would necessarily want to listen to the soundtrack album of, but within context, it's a perfect rendition of what we're seeing on screen very often. It's unsettling and somewhat terrifying.
One thing that To the Devil and Daughter does extraordinarily well, I think, is it makes black magic and black magic ritual something genuinely strange, uncanny and weird, which it hasn't often been. You know, usually when we see representations of black magic, it's somehow sort of safe. We are sort of, you know, as Dracula AD 72 says, you know, we are going to summon up the big daddy with the horns and the tail, and that's it. But, you know, we have a sort of sense, you know, for example, when Father Michael is talking to Bernie down the phone, and he makes him imagine, and he brings him a cord, and he gets his acolyte to bring a cord, and he makes Bernie imagine that there's a snake wrapped around his hand. Suddenly, you know, we haven't seen anything like that in a Hammer film before.
Henry? The cord. Henry, we've always been very close, haven't we? We're very close now. Don't you feel that? We're so close that I can hear your pulse beating. It's beating very fast, Henry. Too fast. I don't think you have very long to live. Where is Catherine?
She's with Verney, John Verney.
It was very much a 70s film, very much of the let it all hang out and we're going to find ourselves ethos of the times, which was absolutely anathema to Wheatley's, frankly, rather reactionary worldview, which was rooted back in the 1930s. So he hated the film.
Dennis Wheatley was appalled when he saw To the Devil a Daughter. He thought it was obscene and disgusting. In fact, he was so upset that he refused to let Hammer make any more films based on his book. The company were looking at perhaps making The Satanist with Christopher Lee and Britt Eklund. That was never going to happen now. I think he was probably wrong, to be honest. I think he was a man out of his time. The world had changed considerably from his heyday back in the 30s and 40s, and this was the way horror was going, and I just don't think he understood what Hammer were doing. John Peacock himself said he was pretty upset by Wheatley's reaction because he wasn't actually trying to set out to do a straight adaptation of the book. He was trying to capture the flavour of the book but bring it more up to date. It could only have worked Wheatley's way if they'd done it in a period setting and it was a bit more genteel. That was not what Hammer were planning to do, and to be honest, it's not what Hammer needed at that point. They needed something more modern, and that's what they attempted to do.
The result of John Peacock and Christopher Wicking tinkering with his original novel was a film that barely resembled his original novel at all. Now that's a reasonable thing, I think, for a novelist to be upset about, but I think Wheatley's hatred for the film went deeper than that. Because it was such a modern film, director Peter Sykes and cinematographer David Watkin had gone out of their way to make the film as of the moment and as modern as possible. And modern really wasn't Wheatley's thing.
I firmly believe that To the Devil a Daughter is the first modern horror film that Hammer makes. It is substantially different from what's gone before, even recently before. There are elements of it which are genuinely alarming, unsettling. It is a world away from Hammer's gloriously coloured Gothic fantasies.
Much of the horror in To the Devil a Daughter is more of an intellectual variety. It's more of a creepy feeling, a sensation, an atmosphere, rather than graphic gore. There are, however, a number of sequences that you'd have thought the BBFC might have objected to. A woman is bled of all her blood. We get Natasha Kinski lying on an altar doing something fairly unspeakable with a mutant baby.
Les Bowie's most obvious contribution to the film To the Devil a Daughter is the monstrous demonic baby. Certainly Christopher Lee was very unhappy about it, thinking that the creature should never have been seen on screen. And there were a number of reviews at the time of its release saying that it looked frankly risible. I think it works perfectly. I think it's a truly nightmarish creation.
Astonishingly, when it went to the BBFC, it passed through completely uncut. Now, at the time, the BBFC had been through quite a few traumatic years, dealing with films like The Devils, and Last Tango in Paris, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Soldier Blue, lots of films with sex and violence. And Stephen Murphy had just left the BBFC to be replaced by James Furman. And James Furman, as we know, later on became quite tyrannical with his decisions at the BBFC, but at the time he seemed to be a bit more lenient. And how To the Devil a Daughter got through is anybody's guess. Changing times, perhaps. I suspect Hammer themselves were quite surprised.
To the Devil and Daughter was not a commercial failure. To the Devil and Daughter made money. The trouble is that Hammer's production partners, with whom they'd had to enter into agreements in order to make the film, took the lion's share of the profits. Hammer couldn't actually use the success of To the Devil and Daughter as a springboard to future productions. Hammer didn't fail. It was the British film industry that failed. Hammer was still big. It was the industry that got small.
I think that To the Devil a Daughter is a natural continuation of Hammer's satanic films, following on from The Devil Rides Out. Although other more mainstream companies were producing a variety of films connected with devil worship and Satanism, I don't think Hammer had come too late to the party. I think that they were approaching it in a somewhat closeted way.
Which is a shame, because I think it's very good. Very good film. It was a more than competent riposte to The Exorcist, and was a big hit, particularly in England.
I think one of the problems is that people do try to compare it to the earlier films, and obviously people would like to compare it to The Devil Rides Out, but that was made in a very different time, by a very different company. Hammer weren't the same in 1974 and 5 as they were back then. I think what you need to do is compare like with like. Don't compare it to those films. No horror films are going to compare to those. Have a look at what was going on around To the Devil a Daughter at the time. Look at that slew of awful devil movies that came out in the wake of The Exorcist. Films like Abby from America, The Tempter from Italy, God knows how many films called Exorcist 3 that were cropping up across Europe.
They put everything into it. They make a very, very good horror film, a very, very horrible horror film, and a horror film that's still exactly as effective today as it was 40 odd years ago.
It exudes a real aura of, it sounds glib to say it, but of evil. It really has those reverberations of evil that Christopher Lee once referred to, really do come out of this film. There's something very, very disquieting and disconcerting about the film.
I think we tend to characterise it as being at the end of something, but actually it was a new beginning. It's just that new beginning never quite happened.